You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, it looks like Donald Trump's last gasp here of some relief in his New York criminal trial has just come up short. Can you explain what just happened here?
Yeah, Brian, the highest court of appeals in the state of New York just rejected Donald Trump's attempt to get his gag order tossed out. So, it's been pretty much a clean sweep. Every judge in both state courts and in federal courts, both trial court judges and appellate court judges who had to take up the issue of whether Donald Trump's, speech and his posts are so violence-inducing, so dangerous that he needs to have a limited gag order placed on him. Every single judge has ruled, you're damn right he does, and it withstands appeal over and over and over again, and now it is a completely settled question in the courts of New York. I guess better late than never, because he's got a sentencing date coming up in just 3 weeks or so on July 11th. But the gag order will remain in full effect until the time he is sentenced.
And that was my question. Was this ruling to just determine whether the gag order was actually valid, which seems kind of moot at this point, or was it really just to determine whether that gag order could remain in place until that July 11th sentencing?
Yeah, it was a little of both, because what happened was Judge Merchan instituted the gag order to try to protect everybody that Donald Trump was endangering during the course of his New York State Court prosecution. Donald Trump appealed that to the first appellate court in New York, and some time ago, they rejected Donald Trump's appeal, saying, and I quote, Judge Merchan properly weighed Trump's First Amendment rights against the court's responsibility to ensure the fair administration of justice in criminal cases and the right of persons related to the proceedings to be free from threats, intimidation, harassment, and harm. That was the ruling of the first Court of Appeals in New York. And then back during his trial, when Donald Trump was actually being tried for the 34 felony counts indicted against him, he appealed that to the highest court in New York State. That is the ruling we just got. So it's a little bit of a delayed ruling, but it does mean that this gag order will remain in effect through the life of the case, which will terminate come sentencing time on July 11th.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but is the reason that this is so significant because all of his contempt charges against him, I think there were 10 or 11, were predicated on his violations of the gag order. So he was hoping that the gag order wouldn't have been valid, and so that would kind of retroactively eliminate those contempt charges, which, by the way, could be taken into account when sentencing comes around. But because the highest court in New York then ruled that the gag order is valid, can stay in effect, it would then mean that those contempt charges also remain in effect and can play a factor here when sentencing rolls around in July.
Brian, I swear it's like you're earning a legal breakdown law degree because it's such an important point, but there's actually a pretty nuanced area of the law when it comes to somebody who violates a court order. Let's talk about that. You're absolutely right. Given that the highest court in New York has now affirmed the legality and constitutionality of Judge Merchan's gag order of Donald Trump, it makes it that much easier moving forward, come sentencing time, for Judge Merchan to say, yeah, and by the way, I found you in criminal contempt 10 times, 10 counts, for violating my gag order that the highest court in our state just said was lawful and constitutional. That's important. But here's the thing. The law actually requires somebody to obey a court order even while that court order is involved in appellate litigation. Because otherwise you could kind of say, well, I've appealed it, so now I guess I get to violate the gag order or any court order with impunity. So interestingly, there's a body of case law, appellate court case law, precedent that says you must obey it. And if you are found to be in violation, even if some higher court ultimately rules that the court order suffered from some infirmity, you could still be held accountable for violating that court order. So it's an interesting area of the law, but you kind of hit right on the most important point.
And can you just build on that a little bit more? The implications that Donald Trump violating this gag order 11 times, racking up those contempt charges 10 or 11 times during the trial, the impact that that may have on sentencing when that rolls around.
It should have an enormous impact, and I hope it does. Only Judge Merchan knows for sure how he will weigh it in to the sentencing calculation. But, every judge has an absolute responsibility to control their proceedings and to make sure that nobody interferes in either the due administration of justice or, threatening, harassing, intimidating anybody else who's associated with the proceedings, like witnesses, jurors, judges, prosecutors, etc. So Judge Merchan placed that gag order on Donald Trump, and he violated it 10 times. That's 10 separate criminal offenses, and Judge Merchan found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of those 10 crimes of contempt of court. That's mind-blowing. Brian, in my 30 years as a prosecutor, I don't think I ever had it happen once, never mind 10 times during the course of a trial. If that does not persuade Judge Merchan that Donald Trump has no regard for the rule of law, has no regard for judicial authority, has no regard for the safety of everybody who's involved in the endeavor of trying to hold him accountable for his crimes, and has no regard for the due administration of justice, I don't know what will persuade Judge Merchan. I think it should weigh heavy on the scale in favor of a lengthy jail term, quite frankly, not only for his 34 felony convictions, but for his complete disregard and undermining of the criminal justice system by violating court orders with what he thought was impunity. And I think it will serve as an important lesson for the other judges who are still, presiding over criminal cases involving Donald Trump. Judge McAfee down in Georgia, Judge Chutkan, once she gets it back from the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and I will throw into the mix, just for fun, Judge Cannon down in Florida, although she is about to take up an argument as to whether Donald Trump should be gagged, a limited gag order put in place to try to protect the lives of FBI agents that he's been lying about. That's in the upcoming days, and we'll see if Judge Cannon is at all persuaded by the fact that virtually every other judge, trial court and appellate court judge, who had to weigh the issue of whether these gag orders were not only appropriate, but were lawful and constitutional. Let's see if that has any impact at all at what Judge Cannon decides to do in the case that involves Donald Trump in Florida.
Yeah, I'm sure she's going to be falling over herself to put some restriction on Donald Trump. Glenn, I do want to dig in just for a quick moment on one issue that you had spoken about, and that was this issue of remorse. Can you talk about the importance that a defendant showing remorse for crimes has when it comes to sentencing versus just them being held accountable for the crimes that they were just convicted of? Because, in my mind, whether or not they're remorseful doesn't really seem like it would carry that much weight as opposed to just them being held accountable for the crimes that the trial was about. So can you talk about how Judge Merchan will take those two factors into account and kind of how he weighs them separately?
Yeah, remorse is kind of a kissing cousin to a defendant accepting responsibility for his crimes. They kind of go hand in hand. And the law has set out a series of principles of sentencing, and they apply universally in all jurisdictions. One of the important principles of sentencing is, whether or not the defendant is susceptible to rehabilitation. And what I argued more times than I can count as a prosecutor at a sentencing hearing was, Your Honor, the defendant has steadfastly refused to accept responsibility for his crimes or show any remorse whatsoever for the victims, and that does not bode well for his rehabilitative potential. So we think that should up the sentencing ante for this particular defendant. Donald Trump, as we both know, Brian, as our viewers know, will never take accountability for anything he has done, unless it turns out well. I think he's the one who kind of infamously said when he was asked, do you take any accountability for all of these avoidable COVID deaths? He said, I take no responsibility at all. What a guy. What a guy to have in the Oval Office, right?
Yeah.
So he will not take accountability. He will certainly not show remorse. And those things will absolutely factor into Judge Merchan's sentencing decision. And as I say, they should up the sentencing ante and result in more rather than less of a prison term for Donald Trump.
Okay, well, we will, of course, stay on top of this issue as we get closer and closer to Donald Trump's July 11th sentencing. So for those watching right now, if you want to be able to follow along and discuss all of this as it happens and what the implications are once that sentence is handed down, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.